Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a pretty big concept, the responsibility of intellectuals. We're not just talking philosophy here, though. We're going to be diving into real-world stuff, like ethical problems and even some historical controversies.
Yeah, it's interesting because this isn't just about some old books, right? I mean, we're really trying to figure out the role of thinkers, academics, really anybody with a platform and expertise in a world that's, wrestling with power and injustice and even like how we define truth these days.
Right. It's a question for all of us, I think. So our main source today is a collection of essays reflecting on Noam Chomsky's famous essay from 1967. It's also called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, and it's still causing a stir 50 years later. And to get a good range of views, we've got perspectives from activists like Jackie Walker, academics, and even Craig Murray, a former ambassador who actually blew the whistle on the government on some wrongdoing.
Wow, a former ambassador. That's pretty serious. It really brings up a question for all of us. Whose responsibility is it to speak truth to power? And can it even change anything? Or are we just, preaching to the choir here?
Right. Okay, so to set the stage, let's go back to Chomsky's original essay. It's 1967, the Vietnam War is raging, and Chomsky's calling out intellectuals who are either complicit in U.S. policy or just totally silent about the atrocities. He's basically saying, don't be complicit, use your brains for good. But I mean, was that even realistic back then?
It was a really different world, Chomsky was writing this from the heart of academia. And as he describes it, even in super liberal places, like Cambridge, Massachusetts, people saw anti-war protesters as traitors.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? There's a planned demonstration at Boston Common, which is, their version of Hyde Park, and it got violently broken up by counter demonstrators.
Sure.
Yeah, and even the Boston Globe, which is, famous for being a liberal paper, even they condemned the protesters. So speaking out back then had real consequences.
It really took guts to go against the grain back then.
Absolutely. And Chomsky didn't just, point fingers at institutions. He actually called out specific cases of intellectual complicity. And one that really stands out is John Stuart Mill, the famous philosopher.
Wait, John Stuart Mill, wasn't he all about freedom and individual rights?
Exactly. Yeah, he was a huge champion of individual liberty. But here's the thing. Mill also worked for the East India Company, and he actually justified British colonialism in India. He called it, get this, benevolent despotism.
Hold on. Benevolent despotism. That sounds like a major contradiction. So even brilliant minds can have blind spots.
Exactly. And that's a huge takeaway for everyone, right? We all need to constantly check our own assumptions, no matter how expert we think we are.
Powerful point. And Chomsky went even further, right? He criticized the media for, manufacturing consent and basically silencing anyone who disagreed. He was saying that the institutions that are supposed to keep the public informed were actually just propping up the status quo. But, I mean, has anything really changed since then?
Well, that's what these essays are all wrestling with. For instance, Jackie Walker argues that the injustices against Black people, throughout history, they're still not really acknowledged, which makes it even harder for Black intellectuals to speak truth to power.
So it's not just about speaking out, it's about being heard in the first place.
Yeah. And
then there's social media too, right? Everyone has a voice now, but does it really level the playing field?
Well, it's a double-edged sword for sure. I mean, social media can help bypass corporate control and information can spread really fast, but it also creates these echo chambers where, you just reinforce what you already believe. We all end up in these bubbles where we only consume news that agrees with us.
Yeah, I see that happening all the time. And even when we do see different views, there's this thing called the backfire effect. You'd think, throwing facts at people would change their minds, but research actually shows that it can make them double down on their beliefs even more, even if they're wrong.
It's kind of crazy. It's like our brains are programmed to reject information that challenges our worldview. So just speaking truth to power isn't enough. We need to figure out how to break through these echo chambers and actually have real conversations.
So how do we do that? Was Chomsky just being too idealistic? Is speaking truth to power a lost cause?
Well, not necessarily. The book also shows that truth-telling can work, especially when it leads to action. Look at how public opinion has shifted on things like immigration and climate change.
Okay, so it's not impossible.
Yeah.
But it definitely takes more than just shouting facts into the void.
Right, it takes more than that. And that brings us to some really interesting examples of truth-telling in action. Some of these are inspiring successes, while others really highlight how tricky it can be to deal with power and truth.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's hear about those examples.
Yeah.
What are some instances where speaking truth to power actually made a real difference?
Well, one of the most inspiring stories in the book is this campaign to expose the Indonesian genocide in East Timor. This was back in 1975.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was brutal. I mean, it was largely ignored by the whole international community, but a small group of activists, they actually managed to bring it to light. It's a great example of how, persistent truth-telling can actually make a real difference.
Okay, East Timor. Yeah, I kind of vaguely remember hearing about that. It sounds pretty awful.
Yeah.
How did they even get started? Weren't they, up against some pretty incredible odds?
Totally, yeah. I mean, for decades, this small group of really dedicated people, a lot of them young activists, they worked tirelessly to just raise awareness. And they faced media indifference, political apathy, even like outright hostility from people who supported Indonesia's invasion.
So how did they break through? That sounds like they were like shouting into a hurricane.
Well, they never gave up. And I think, through sheer persistence and by just constantly speaking truth to power, they kind of gradually shifted public opinion. It was a long game for sure, but eventually they generated enough pressure to actually force President Clinton to intervene and end the slaughter.
Wow. Talk about David versus Goliath. That's incredible. It really shows you what dedicated people can do when they just refuse to be silenced. But let's be honest, it doesn't always work out that way, right? What are some of the challenges to truth-telling that we face today?
Well, one thing is that the information landscape is just way more complex than it used to be. To take the rise of direct democracy, for example. Things like referendums where people vote directly on an issue. It seems like a good idea on the surface, right? More democratic.
Yeah, it seems like it cuts out the middleman and just lets people have a direct say. So what's the problem with that?
Well, the book highlights how direct democracy can actually be manipulated by powerful interest groups. You have to think about it. It takes a ton of money and resources to actually sway public opinion, especially on complicated issues.
So even though it's direct, it's not necessarily a level playing field. Whoever has the most money can still have a bigger influence.
Exactly. Yeah. It raises some really tough questions about whether we're really getting, informed and equitable decision making, even in systems that are designed to give power directly to the people. And then another challenge is this increasing pressure to silence dissenting voices, often in the name of, security.
Okay, yeah, I can see where this is going. Are you talking about the UK government's prevents strategy?
Right.
I mean, it's supposed to stop radicalization, but
Yeah.
I've heard some pretty worrying things about how it's being applied.
Yeah, the prevent strategy is definitely a complicated issue. I mean, there are genuine concerns about how it impacts freedom of expression. Critics say that it creates a climate of fear where people, especially from marginalized communities, they're hesitant to speak out, to express views that are different. They're afraid of being labeled radical or extremist, even if they're just, expressing legitimate concerns.
So it's kind of ironic, by trying to prevent terrorism, the government might actually be, silencing the very voices that could help challenge extremist ideologies. That's a tough one. Where do you even draw the line?
Yeah, well, it really highlights that constant tension between, security and freedom of expression. And it's something we really need to be careful about, especially in times of crisis. We can't let fear erode our basic freedoms.
Absolutely. It's like that old saying, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Speaking of slippery slopes, the book also talks about Daniel Bethlehem. He's a lawyer who advised the UK government on the legality of drone strikes. Wasn't that a pretty controversial case?
Yeah, I mean, Bethlehem basically he expanded the definition of imminent threat and argued that you can use lethal force even when an attack isn't about to happen right away. He said it was justified based on a target's pattern of behavior.
Wait, so if someone has a history of violence, they could be considered an imminent threat even if there's no specific evidence that they're planning something right now.
Yeah, that's basically it. And it raises some serious ethical questions about, preemptive strikes and due process. Can we really justify taking a life based on the possibility of future actions rather than, solid evidence of an immediate threat? It's a slippery slope for sure.
Yeah, it feels like we're getting further and further away from that ideal of innocent until proven guilty. Okay, that's That's some pretty heavy stuff. Ready to dive into another complicated case study? This one's pretty close to home for Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, let's do it. This one really gets into the nitty-gritty of how power and intellectual work actually intersect. We're talking about Noam Chomsky and his relationship with MIT.
Ah, yes, MIT, that bastion of academic freedom and military research. The book mentions a chapter by Chris Knight that really dives into this, right?
Right, yeah. Knight, he examines Chomsky's work at the IMARI Corporation, which is a military research institution. And here's the irony. Chomsky, a fierce critic of U.S. militarism, actually working for an institution that was developing technology that was used in the Vietnam War.
Okay, that's kind of hard to wrap my head around. Was Chomsky being hypocritical?
It's more nuanced than that. I mean, to be fair to Chomsky, his role at Middlebury was mainly as a linguist. He wasn't like directly involved in developing weapons or anything. But it does raise these questions about the compromises that intellectuals sometimes have to make, especially when they're working within these powerful institutions.
Yeah, so it's not always black and white. Even someone like Chomsky, who's so outspoken and principled, he still had to navigate these gray areas, and he wasn't exactly comfortable with it, right?
No, not really. The book actually mentions Chomsky's discomfort with his own wife's work at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory. She was involved in an air defense project, and he clearly struggled with the implications of scientific research being used for military purposes, even within his own family.
That's a really powerful example of how these ethical dilemmas can be so personal, right? It's not just about some abstract principles. It's about real people wrestling with these really tough choices. And later on, Chomsky actually expressed regret for not speaking out against the Vietnam War sooner. So even he acknowledged that he could have done more.
Right. It's a reminder that even the most principled people can get caught up in these complex webs of institutional power and complicity. It's not always easy to see the big picture when you're right in the middle of it. And this leads to a bigger question that we all need to think about. If intellectuals have this responsibility to speak truth to power, do they also have a responsibility to make sure that their knowledge and expertise aren't being used for harmful purposes?
Whoa. That's a tough one. I mean, how can you even control how your research is used ultimately? It seems like once it's out there, it's out there.
Yeah, it is a difficult question, and there are no easy answers. But it's a question that all intellectuals, especially those working in fields with potential military or harmful applications, they have to wrestle with it. It's about understanding the possible consequences of your work and doing what you can to make sure it's not used for bad things.
So it's not just about speaking truth to power. It's also about being aware of how your knowledge and your expertise can be used, even if you don't have total control over it. That's a lot of responsibility.
It is, but it also shows how important ethical reflection is and taking a critical look at your own work. It's about asking tough questions and understanding that knowledge and power always come with responsibility.
Okay, before we get too bogged down by all this responsibility, let's take a step back and recap what we've learned so far. We've explored the historical context of Chomsky's essay, how the role of intellectuals has changed, and some of the very real challenges to truth-telling in today's world. But where did that leave us? Well, what can we as individuals do with all this information?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while there aren't any easy answers, the book does offer some good insights. One of the key takeaways is how important it is to understand how different forms of power are actually all interconnected.
Okay, break that down for me. What do you mean by interconnected power?
Well, we can't just focus on, government power. We also need to pay attention to the influence of corporations, the media, and even social media platforms. It's kind of like a complex ecosystem where all these different players are exerting influence in different ways.
Yeah, it's like those diagrams you see in biology class, where all the different systems in the body are all connected. If one system goes haywire, it affects the whole organism.
Exactly. The different forms of power all intersect and they influence each other. And understanding how this works is crucial if you want to, effectively challenge injustice and make positive changes.
So it's not just about calling out, individual bad actors. It's about seeing the bigger picture and understanding the systemic forces that are at play. But how do we even begin to tackle something that's so big and so complex?
Well, that's where collective action comes in. As inspiring as individual acts of courage and truth-telling can be, real lasting change often requires organized movements and collective effort. Think about the civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, or even more recent movements like Black Lives Matter or the fight for climate justice. All of these movements are about people coming together, making their voices louder and demanding change on a systemic level.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. There's power in numbers. But what about the role of intellectuals in all of this? Aren't they supposed to be the ideas people, not the action people?
Well, intellectuals have a really crucial role to play in supporting and amplifying these movements. They can use their skills and their knowledge and their platforms to help educate the public, provide analysis, and hold those in power accountable. It's about being more than just a detached observer. It's about actively being a part of the struggle for a more just and equitable world.
Right. It's about putting those ideas into action, using your intellect to make a real difference in the world. So it's not just about speaking truth to power. It's about rolling up your sleeves and getting involved in the fight for justice.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that final thought-provoking question we always like to leave our listeners with. If intellectuals have this responsibility to speak truth to power, do they also have a responsibility to make sure that their knowledge and their expertise are not used for harmful purposes?
That's a heavy question. It feels like that classic superhero dilemma. With great power comes great responsibility.
It is, and it's a question that deserves a lot of thought, not just by intellectuals, but by all of us. In this age of rapidly advancing technology and artificial intelligence and increasing concentration of power, this question becomes even more urgent. We all have a role to play in making sure that knowledge and innovation are used ethically and for the good of humanity.
So it's not just about speaking truth to power. It's about shaping the very nature of power itself, making sure it's used for good and not for harm.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners to ponder that thought.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the responsibility of intellectuals. It's a complex and challenging and ultimately a really deeply human issue. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, to challenge assumptions, and to use your own voice to speak truth to power. Until next time. Okay, I'm getting it. We need to be aware of how power works. We need to work together. We need to make sure our knowledge isn't, used for evil. But how do we actually put all that into practice? It feels kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about, but the good news is you don't have to figure it all out by yourself. Remember those collective action movements we talked about? That's a good place to start, to plug in and make a difference. Find something you're passionate about and join up with other people who are working towards the same goals.
Right, find your tribe, get to work. But what about those of us who aren't activists? What can we do in our everyday lives to actually live up to this whole responsibility of intellectuals thing?
Well, it starts with being, informed and engaged citizens. Read critically, question things, and don't be afraid to have tough conversations, even if it means, challenging your own beliefs.
So no more hiding in our echo chambers, right? We need to actively seek out different perspectives, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Right, exactly. And don't underestimate the power of your own voice, Speak up when you see injustice, share information, and support organizations that are doing work that you believe in. It all makes a difference.
It's like that saying, be the change you want to see in the world. But it's not just about individual actions, is it? We also need to hold institutions accountable.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Support universities and research institutions that actually prioritize ethics and the public good, over profit or military stuff. Demand transparency from the government and corporations and hold the media accountable for giving us accurate and unbiased information.
So it's about using our power as citizens, as consumers, as members of different communities to push for a more ethical and responsible way of using knowledge and power.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. It's a lifelong thing and it's not always easy, but if we all do our part, we can create a world where knowledge and power are used to actually benefit humanity, not harm it.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so On that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on. Any final words of wisdom before we wrap things up?
Just this. Don't underestimate the power of your own, your own intellect and your own voice. We all have a part to play in shaping a more just and an equitable future. So go out there and make your voice heard.
Couldn't said it better myself. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. It's been enlightening and challenging and hopefully empowering. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning things, keep learning, and keep speaking truth to power. Until next time.